Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson, and with me today is writer David Leaf, and you may know him as one of the Beach Boys biographers. I guess people call him the main biographer, the original biographer. So, David, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, Matt. I know you're up in cold Milwaukee, and we're in semi-cold Southern California today.
Well, yeah, it's always a little chilly up here, but yeah, I get, I keep better up here, I guess that's why. But yeah, so you've got a new book out called Smile, the Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson. And it just came out last week. This is spring 2025 here. And we're going to talk a bit about that book and about the Beach Boys. But first, for those people, Beach Boys fans know exactly who you are. But for some of my viewers who are not quite familiar with your work, you originally wrote the book Beach Boys and the California Myth. That was in 1978. That was the first real biography on the band, and you had moved to California, but you have a very long list of credits here. I didn't realize how many documentaries and television work you did. I considered you more of a writer first, but really you've done quite a lot of film work.
It's an interesting way to look at it. Actually, I think of myself as a storyteller,
Hmm.
whether it's in print or in documentary form or working on a television show. It's really what's the story that we're going to tell, and that goes back to my earliest days as a sports writer for the local newspaper and the high school newspaper and the college newspaper, and I just wanted to tell stories about things that mattered to me.
Well, you certainly have told a lot. Let me just run through a few here. So just first of all, you were at the tender age of 26. You wrote the biography on the Beach Boys, which I thought was very impressive. And we're going to talk about what that progressed to. But some of your documentaries include Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson, The Story of Smile, Who is Harry Nilsson and Why is Everybody Talking About Him? The Night James Brown Saved Boston, The U.S. versus John Lennon, The Bee Gees, This Is Where I Came In, The Unknown Peter Sellers. You've done stuff about Mickey Mantle. You mentioned the sports, and you've done plenty of television work as well.
Yeah, it's not a career that I planned. When I moved to California, I had a number of goals, but primary amongst them was I had formulated this notion: I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile. So my obsession with the Beach Boys, with Brian and Smile, was always at the forefront, but it really wasn't my career. My career was trying to make a living as a writer, whether it was in books or television or in documentaries.
Well, and for your work, you've got honors. You got a Peabody and WGAW award, two Emmy nominations, and two Grammy nominations. So quite well rounded.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's been quite an unexpected career in many ways. I mean, just great moments. The Peabody was for the all network telethon in right after 9/11.
Hmm.
And what could be more thrilling? I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, than standing next to Muhammad Ali as he's about to go out and speak to a worldwide audience about what 9/11 meant to him.
Mhm.
I mean, the people who I've gotten to spend time with, it's kind of a who's who of my 60s heroes, if you will.
Yeah, you've certainly rubbed shoulders with some big time people, and obviously you fulfilled your dream when you did move out to Los Angeles to write that biography and meet Brian Wilson and help get Smile released. That's literally what happened. And I want to talk a little bit about your role in that because I didn't initially understand how much one man really helped push that along. And it was a long process and a delicate process. So, can you tell us a little bit about how obviously, most people were assuming here they know what Smile is, the great unreleased album by the Beach Boys that never came out in 1967. And it's been talked about for years and years, and it still hasn't really been released, but in some ways it has. So, why don't you give us a little bit of a history of that journey?
So in 1971, the first issue of Rolling Stone magazine I ever bought, the Beach Boys were on the cover, and I bought it because they were on the cover. I was a fan. but I was hardly a fanatic at that point.
Is that this one here?
That is indeed that issue.
Yeah, so I actually have this issue. I've got some old issues I use for my research, but yeah, when Rolling Stone was really a solid, really great, gave some great information.
So reading that article by Tom Nolan, which was timed to promote the Surf's Up album by the Beach Boys, Surf's Up being one of the piece songs of the already lamented and shelved Smile album. I was inspired to buy the Surf's Up album from that article. And when I heard Surf's Up, I was like, wait a second, why would anybody not be excited to put this music out? This is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And the song just before it on Surf's Up, Till I Die, was one of the saddest songs I'd ever heard, but beautiful in the way In My Room and Don't Worry Baby were. And it struck me that Brian still had the talent to do it. So that was kind of a 1-2 musical punch, if you will. It was, he can still do it. Here's Surf's Up, which is evidence of what the article talked about, this Lost Smile album and the troubles that Brian had gone through in his entire life, from starting with an abusive childhood. And then right around then, I saw the Beach Boys at Georgetown University. I was going to college in DC, and it was a staggeringly great show. They did, I think, 6 songs from the Surf's Up album, including Surf's Up. And with things happened that now that I look back on everything, it seems like there was a certain calling, missionary quality to everything, certain serendipity to it, because after that concert, I was standing outside with my friend. We were waiting for a ride back to George Washington, and he said, "Look," and I looked in the wrong direction, and he goes, "No, look." And standing next to me was Mike Love of the Beach Boys,
Hmm.
and like any fan, I started badgering him with questions about Smile. And he was like, "Relax, I'll talk about it. I'm going to write my memoir and I'll answer all the questions." So that was my first encounter with a Beach Boy. Um, but because of those 3 things, the article in Rolling Stone, which was a 2-part story, the Surf's Up album, and seeing them in concert, then I started going back and listening to earlier albums. I was going into the cutout bins and finding a bunch of Beach Boys albums that no longer were in print. And and my roommate and I became obsessed with Smile and what happened to Brian Wilson. And I'd started as a journalism major in college and studied Edward R. Murrow. And he became something of a hero to me, in that I realized that in telling a story, you could tell it in such a way it might change the outcome of the story. He had famously done that in the 1950s during the witch hunts, the Army McCarthy hearings. He essentially let Joe McCarthy hang himself in his own words. And I didn't have that in mind in my work, but it's just something in the back of my mind. You could do that. And in talking about Smile with my roommate, he says, "Well, if you're so upset about it," and of course those were my teenage outrage years. It was like, I said, "You know what? I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian, become his friend, and help him finish Smile." That's essentially how obsessed I was, how fanatical I was. It was like, in your high school class, somebody's the president, and everyone says, "Well, one day I'm going to be president of the United States." Well, somebody is going to be president of the United States, and I'm the one who moved to California and wrote that book. Um, it was almost simultaneously to an authorized biography of the Beach Boys, but it was, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was the kind of the first one to pull all the information together in a
Mhm.
coherent way about their career.
And it was a
And
very topsy-turvy career too. At that point, it was, they were trying to stay relevant, and it was a difficult time for them. But yeah, that I could see that would be difficult.
it was, looking back, as I do in the Smile book, because now I'm the silver-haired I'm the elder statesman of Beach Boys history now, of Brian Wilson history. And I look back, and when you look at 1967 and when Brian shelved Smile and all the other chaos around the Beach Boys, what one realizes is they almost instantly became irrelevant in popular music.
Mhm.
Things were changing so quickly. It's they had their run of hits, and they would have a hit from time to time, like "Darlin'" or "Do It Again," but their place in the pop pantheon ended when Brian shelved Smile. And so Smile became this mythic thing that what if they had put it out before Sergeant Pepper? What if they had put it out after Sergeant Pepper? All these what ifs. And of course, there's no answer to a what if. There's only the story of what happened as best as it can be told. And that became, again, sort of a mission for me, ultimately culminating in the documentary Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of Smile. But along the way, there were steps that, at the time I didn't realize were going to lead to Brian Wilson Presents Smile and the Beach Boys Smile box set. I had no idea that was going to happen. I began working with Capitol Records in 1990 on what are called the twofers, where they were releasing the Beach Boys catalog on CD,
Oh.
two albums per CD.
Yes, I had bought a few of those. That's how I got some of those bonus tracks. So I bought those. Those were great.
They thank you. They were, Mark Lynette, went deep into the vaults, and then I wrote liner notes. And after that, we were asked to do a 30th anniversary box set on the Beach Boys. The late Andy Paley, the great Andy Paley, and I and Mark Lynette, and we came up with a track listing. By then I had become good friends with Brian. I had really never worked with him. We were friends. The only time I really worked with him was when Warner Brothers Records hired me in 1988 to work on the press kit for his first solo album.
Okay.
Um, and those years were, as Brian describes them, 9 years in prison. But the music that came out, his first solo album, is still my favorite solo album of his career. It just, again, it proved that he could still do it, regardless of the circumstances, if there was enough encouragement and sort of what I came to call unconditional love around him. Anyway, we're doing this box set, and I sit down with him to go over the track listing for it. And apologies to Beach Boys fans for leaving off The Traitor. Carl Wilson's The Traitor should have been on the box set, but it didn't make it. I to this day I don't know why, but at any rate, I sat down with Brian to go over the track listing, and there was one song he wanted taken off. And as the composer, arranger, producer of that music, you don't want it on there? Okay, I respect that. And then I kind of took a deep breath and said, Brian, there's a giant hole in this box set between the Good Vibrations single and the Heroes and Villains single. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, you spent 6 or 7 months working on Smile. And I'm not asking you to finish it, but it really feels like there should be some songs from the Smile sessions in that spot on the box set. And he said, okay, which songs do you think? And I very quickly rattled off a bunch of titles, the ones that are on the box set. I purposely did not mention Mrs. O'Leary's Cow because Smile, the fire slash Mrs. O'Leary Cow has been pointed to as kind of a turning point of negativity in the Smile sessions. At any rate, we got between what was on disc 2 of the box set and what Mark Lynette put on from Smile Sessions on disc 5, the bonus disc. We had almost an hour of Smile music on the box set, and I really thought that was going to be the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was really excited that we had gotten Smile music officially released in one place, as opposed to kind of the scatter shot
Right.
that had happened prior to that.
Yeah,
And
prior to that, if I recall, it was the Good Vibrations box set that was that what had, or did that come
that's
after?
no, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Good
The Good
Vibrations box
Vibrations.
set.
Okay, yes, because I do remember when that came out. I thought, wow, I didn't think this stuff was going to come out. I didn't realize that it was that. It sounded more complete than I had imagined it. So I was thrilled.
We were all thrilled. It led to the box set actually going gold, which I think for a box set is pretty unusual. Um, and I was still in the 1990s. I had a couple of conversations with Brian about Smile. I said to him once, you know, Brian, this music is so beautiful. Why don't we get a symphony orchestra and a choir to do this so that people can hear it? And his answer was classic Brian. Good. I deserve it. Another time, I wrote down on 3x5 index cards the names of every Smile piece that we knew of. And he and I stood at the kitchen table trying to sequence it to no avail. But I could talk to him about Smile, unlike I'm almost certain that in every interview he did, from the moment he shelved Smile to the moment it came out, as Brian Wilson presents Smile, he was asked about it. And sometimes he would say it's inappropriate music, or I don't want to talk about it, or he, you know, in one case I know of, he just got up and walked out of the house and got in his car and drove away from the interview. So, so Smile was not a happy subject for him. It reminded him of a very dark period of his life. And in 1999, he began touring, which is really the major turning point, because if it wasn't for the assemblage of that band, Brian Wilson Presents Smile wouldn't have happened. So at the end of 99, we're at a Christmas party at, at Scott Bennett's house, one of the members of the band. And my late wife, who was a dear friend of Brian's, was sitting on the piano bench with him with her back to the piano. And he knew how much she loved Christmas. And he said to her, well, what do you want for Christmas? And she said, for you to play Heroes and Villains. And he said, okay. And he turned around and played Heroes and Villains, which just, as the British would say, everybody in the house was gobsmacked, because no one had ever heard him play it. No one had ever dared ask him to play it. And there he was playing it. And when he finished it, I said, Brian, you should do that at the tribute at Radio City, which was scheduled for March of 2001, a program that I had spent at least a half dozen years trying to get financed and made. And thanks to the late Chip Racklin and Phil Ramone, we finally got it off the ground with Elton John and Billy Joel and Paul Simon and Carly Simon and Jimmy Webb and Vince Gill and a whole host, Sir George Martin. I mean, it was just an amazing night. And that night, because I was the kind of the creator and of the program and the writer and producer of it, I had a lot to say about what songs would be done, and I insisted Smile music be included. So the show opens with the Boys Choir of Harlem performing Our Prayer, which was back when Brian recorded it originally in '66, was just called The Prayer. The first piece he recorded with the Beach Boys for what was, you know, going to be the Smile album. So they opened the show with that. And then Vince Gill, David Crosby, and Jimmy Webb did perform Surfed Up. Uh, Vince Gill, David Crosby, and Jimmy Webb formed Surfs Up. And you can go online and Google it, and it's just a staggering performance. And Vince Gill had never even heard the song until about a week before the show. He had agreed to do like Surfing USA or something like that. And it's just amazing what he did. He's an amazing person, an amazing artist, and a great golfer, I found out.
Ah,
But you know, that sort of brought the house down. And Brian is in the wings watching this, and he's seeing how the music is being received. He hears what George Martin has to say that night about him, about how important his work in the '60s was to the Beach Boys. He sees George Martin. He hears George Martin sitting in the wings. Brian watches as George Martin talks about how important the Beach Boys music had been to the Beatles in the 1960s. And when it's his turn and he comes out and he opens his set with Heroes and Villains, it's just the New York audience is in America the biggest Beach Boys city, and they went absolutely crazy for it. And he started adding songs from Smile to his touring band's set list. And at that point, there was still no thought of any completion of Smile. It just wasn't in the cards. But in 2000 and 2001, he was performing Pet Sounds start to finish. So he saw how great his band was. He saw that they were capable of performing his music, not only note perfect, but with perfect feeling. And in 2002, he took that tour to England at the Royal Festival Hall. And of course, it sold out all 4 nights. London being the biggest city outside the United States that are Brian Wilson fans. The British have always worshipped Pet Sounds. And Glenn Max, who ran the Royal Festival Hall, it was like, okay, how do we follow that? And so the conversation sort of began. Well, the only way to follow Pet Sounds is with what Brian intended in 1966 with Smile. And so there's kind of this chattering going on. How's that going to happen? What would it take to do it? And Brian's late wife, Melinda, said, Brian, fans on the message board are saying they'd really love to see you do Smile. And he's kind of reluctant, but he's listening. He's taking it in. And then it kind of came together when the Royal Festival Hall essentially commissioned Brian and his band to do it as an art piece because nobody knew if it would be successful or not. Nobody knew if there would be a tour, if there would be an album. So when Brian and his band started to put it together, learn it, rehearse it, when they went to England, it was with, okay, we're playing some dates at the Royal Festival Hall and some other dates around England, but nobody knew if Brian would even walk up the steps and do it the first night in London. And I was indeed one of those terrified as to what was going to happen. I went from friend to documentarian with him during that period because I'd gone to England in May of 2003 when he announced that he was going to be doing Smile. And when I came back from that trip, my wife and I, we just bought plane tickets in advance and made hotel reservations because if Brian's going to do Smile, we have to be there to cheer him on. And sometime that summer, after completely ignoring any work on Smile for months, we're walking back from the movies, he and I, up the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, going to my apartment. And he says, I can't do this unless you're there with me every day. And I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? How can I be there with you every day? He says, it's like he was saying, I need your love and unconditional support to be there. I said, Brian, I've got a company. We make documentaries. The only way I could be there every day was if we made a documentary. And he said, okay.
That's great.
So that night we talked to Melinda about it, and she says, well, what will the fans think about this documentary? And I was a little bit profane in my answer, but basically what I said is we're not making a film for the fans. We're making a film for the 99% of the people in this world who don't know what Smile is, who don't understand this story. That's who the film is going to be for. And that's what we did. And it was an amazing journey. The second day of vocal rehearsals, Brian got up and said, I got to go, and drove himself to the emergency room at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. So it was quite a roller coaster.
Well, you not only was it done, it was a huge triumph. And then after the London shows and the touring, the Smile sessions were released. And that was the thing I was really waiting for. I did listen to the Brian Wilson's Presents Smile, and I was really amazed at how well it went together. And I'm like, how come this wasn't done? Obviously, it was a Herculean event to get that done, but it seemed like it was effortlessly performed because it was so good. So after that, once the Smile Sessions came out, that I started to sink my teeth into that because that's kind of my thing, is the 60s era stuff. So then all of us that wanted that, everybody, it was like the best of both worlds.
Sure. Well, so we have to give Darian Sahanaja credit for how he helped Brian reconstruct Smile in 2003. I mean, he's really the unsung hero. And of course, Van Dyke came in and wrote and rewrote some new lyrics for some tracks that hadn't had lyrics. And it does seem effortless when you watch it perform. I mean, it was unexpectedly joyous for Brian. We knew how scared he would be. And so the story of him getting up on stage and doing it is really about somebody with the courage to overcome, as he put it, the demons, the fears he had, and and not only triumph, but when he got back from that first tour, he called me and he said, "Hey, David, you got to come over tomorrow. We have to do an interview." Now, I would imagine in the preceding 35 years or very few days where Brian said, "Gee, I want to do an interview today."
Not, yeah, not his forte.
Not at all. But so I went over there and I said, okay, well, why'd you want to do an interview? He says, David, you're not going to believe it. Smile got better and better every night. Uh, and for the first time in my career, I can't wait to go back on the road again. He
Hmm.
says, we're going to go in the studio and record it. And I said, well, what was better about it? And he looked at me like I was a moron. He says, he says, the singing got better. The playing got better, you know. And I said, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rank Pet Sounds and Smile? He says, well, I'd give Pet Sounds a 4 and Smile a 10.
Wow.
And later on in subsequent interviews, he upgraded Pet Sounds to a 7.
Okay.
But it's amazing. An album that has consistently been either at number one or in the top five of the greatest albums of all time. He's talking about Smile being exponentially better. And that's how he felt about it. Um, and because he did that, it changed his life. There's a quote on the back of the book from him. He talks about the world premiere in London, and he says the most cathartic experience of my life.
Hmm.
Well, that's a pretty triumphant moment
Yeah.
to be able to say that. So now there is some semblance of a song order. As Brian said in interviews, this is how I feel about the music now. Is it how it would have been done in 67? Absolutely not. He's very clear about that. He said to me, David, I would have needed a year to figure out how to do it and finish it in 1967. And I figured nobody would give me a year. In those days, record companies were expecting two albums, 3 albums a year from Brian.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
he knew what he was talking about. I mean, they had sabotaged Pet Sounds with Best of the Beach Boys. They just the demand for what record companies politely called product was insatiable, as they would prove with one best of after another. Regardless of what the Beach Boys were doing, there was nothing but best of albums coming out that were kind of taking the attention away from potential Beach Boys record buyers. Oh, I can buy the best of. Oh, I can buy the best of Volume 2. Oh, I can buy the best of Volume 3. Oh, I can buy this one and that one. And it made it very difficult for the Beach Boys to kind of regroup, as they did in the early 70s with a series of albums that were, from Sunflower, Surfs Up, Carl and the Passions, and Holland. They were making their case that they were a credible artistic group, regardless of how much Brian was participating. So it was a very difficult time for everybody in the group. And then, as you said, the Beach Boys Smile Sessions came out in 2011, which I don't think would have happened if Brian hadn't done what he had done, and they were able to mimic his song sequence very well. And of course, anyone listening to the original Smile Sessions would think a couple of things. One, this is unbelievable, and two, nobody could ever sing better than the Beach Boys did on those sessions. There's just no question about it. Their vocals are staggeringly great. As much as they didn't necessarily understand what Brian was trying to do, they came through heroically with the Beach Boys blend. That, as he told me, he needed that Beach Boys blend to finish Smile. He said I could sing all of the parts myself. He could do that and ping pong the tracks, and you wouldn't necessarily know the difference, but they had become his musical instrument that he had played, so to speak, on Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights and Let Him Run, The Little Girl I Once Knew, and Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations. He needed that instrument to fulfill his vision for Smile. And they did it. And somewhere in 67 he got lost. There was a demand for a single and talk of a two-part Heroes and Villains single. They kept recording and recording. There was problems with the record company. There was problems within the group. There was problems with drug taking. Uh, there was just all sorts of issues that suddenly in 2011 they were all pushed aside, and here were the Beach Boys Smile sessions presented to us.
Yeah, and I was very thrilled to get those. And, I'm like, well, I was surprised at how complete it sounded. I mean, I thought that there was probably enough done. Something could have been released, but it may not have been Brian's vision. I don't know if he had another year to work on it, if it would have wound up as a double album. I'm not sure, but I guess none of us know. But the beauty of it is that we get the smile sessions and we can make our own smile, which has been the greatest gift that the Beach Boys have given us to finally get that to us in the computer age where we can put our own things together. Had it come out in 71 as planned with some of the contracts they were signing with, I think it was Warner Brothers, that was asking for that to be part of the deal of them signing with that label, and that never happened. Well, now we can kind of, as fans, we can assemble our own and help Brian finish it, which is so much fun.
Well, he, the technology obviously didn't exist in 67 or 71 or 81 to do what happened in 2011. I think Todd Rundgren might have been the one who suggested at some point in the 1990s that a CD-ROM should come out
Hmm.
with all the
Yeah,
Smile sessions.
that was
So,
Rundgren. Yeah.
but in the late 70s and early 80s, the DIY world, the do-it-yourself world of Smile really took hold, and there was a series of bootlegs. Dominic Priori's great Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, which gathered all of the press from the time that was kind of the mythological media that had created the legend of Smile. You can now read it all in one place. And so a group of people took hold of the myth who aren't necessarily Beach Boys fans. They became part of a Smile cult, if you will.
Mhm.
And so it's not that there weren't great Beach Boys albums made before and after the original Smile sessions. It was just that the story of this unreleased album, for all of the reasons that I outline in the book, and maybe I'm missing, I think I mentioned 8 or 9 or 10 reasons. Brian offers six, I think. Um, there's just no way of knowing why it didn't happen and what it would have taken and what it would have meant at the time. But we don't have to ask those questions anymore. We can just, as you said, listen to it as it's been presented to us. And if you want, you can resequence it to your heart's desire. Um, David Anderley, who was the head of Brother Records, is very clear that he doesn't think Good Vibrations was going to be part of Smile. He just saw that as the step to Smile, that Good Vibrations was his modular uh, experiment, if you will, a number 1 million selling experiment. And then he wanted to make a whole album using that style. So Good Vibrations being part of Smile on the slicks that the cover slicks that Capitol Records produced was what record companies did. Your latest hit single has to be on the album. But where it would have gone in 67, I don't know. Uh,
Yeah.
Brian might have fought them on that. Who the heck knows? But he had kind of run out of uh, steam to battle, if you will. And he tried to do things in 67 that showed that the talent was still there, but the will and the ambition to 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 conquer the music industry was fast fading. So he did a piece called "Can't Wait Too Long," which I think is his beautiful piece of music as he's composed right after Smile. And then he began working with a group he named Redwood and recorded two tracks, Time to Get Alone and Darlin'. And Time to Get Alone is an unbelievable piece. And those who talk about Brian's lyrical ability, just listen to what he wrote on that song and how clear it is. He's telling you how he feels. Time to get alone. You know, he's kind of had it. Now,
Yeah.
he also has tremendous loyalty to the Beach Boys, which is one of the reasons he shelved the Smile album. He thought it might destroy the group. And they came to him when he was recording Time to Get Alone in Darlin' with Redwood and said, "No, you can't do this with them. If you're going to record, you have to record with us." And to me, that marks the end of Brian Wilson, Beach Boy producer, if you will. He would continue to write and record with them. The Wild Honey album is obviously filled with his songs. 2020 has his music. Each album would have fewer and fewer pieces from him. But the fact that he wasn't able to stand up and say, no, Brother Records was formed for me to do outside projects, and this is an outside project I want to do. He wasn't able to do that. He wasn't able to
Yeah.
stand up to them. And that's it's kind of heartbreaking to say the least.
Well, I take the other opposite view. I think it's heartbreaking for the Beach Boys because I view Pet Sounds and Smile essentially as Brian Wilson's solo projects. And he moved so far away from the Beach Boys as a group. He wasn't using them instrumentally. He essentially assembled his coterie of followers, the Anderleys and the Michael Vossis and the Van Dyke Parks, the marijuana consumption squad, as they called themselves, as a surrogate band. So, and then he's recording these songs with Redwood. Like, I would be saying, what the hell, Brian? Are we a group or aren't we? And without Brian Wilson, I mean, I don't know how far they could have gone. Well, we saw a little bit of that because Brian pulled away a lot. He had more mental issues in the late 60s. So it was a shame that more couldn't be made of the group. I think that Brian went too far outside of the group. And if that's where his vision was, then maybe he should have left the group. I think you can't have it both ways. And he
Well,
really didn't.
well, he thought he could. I mean, he had recorded an enormous number of pieces of music outside the group prior to Pet Sounds. You think of, Guess I'm Dumb, the great single that he
Oh,
did
yeah. That's a great
Glenn
song.
Campbell. That the only reason that was done with Glenn Campbell is somebody in the Beach Boys said, "No, we're not going to record a song called Guess I'm Dumb because Beach Boys aren't dumb." Now, how
Yeah.
perfectly would Guess I'm Dumb have fit on side two of Beach Boys today or on Pet Sounds? I mean,
Yeah.
he had recorded with a lot of people. He had given songs to Jan and Dean. I mean, the bounty of his musical output was staggering. So yeah, Pet Sounds could have been a solo album, but he was loyal to the group. And so when he wants to do a single with Redwood and they're saying, no, you can't, the loyalty isn't being returned. He didn't say, I'm not going to work with the Beach Boys anymore. He was saying, I'm doing this single with these guys. Now, Brian was pretty sharp. He wanted to be ahead of what everybody else was doing. And he recognized if you think about what was on the charts in 65, 66, 67 in terms of vocal groups, you had the Mamas and the Papas and the Association and the Turtles and all manner of harmony groups having hit records. So Brian was looking for a group of singers who had a grittier sound, a more R&B sound, and Danny Hutton, Corey Wells, and Chuck Negron were giving him a new musical instrument to play with. Now, I think it was their good fortune that what happened because I think leaving the Brother Records orbit and renaming themselves Three Dog Night is why they ended up being the most successful pop group of the 60s and early 70s. I mean, it was almost, their karma
Yeah.
for that to happen. But what if Brian had done that single and then said, okay, now it's time to do a Beach Boys album? What would have been the harm? I'm not sure uh, why he felt imprisoned the way he did. He felt tremendous loyalty that had been instilled by his father, who had basically been beating on him since he could, walk. And so when Brian didn't go on tour in '63 and they had to bring Al Jardine back to replace him, well, Brian, you're not holding up your end of the deal here. You're being disloyal to the band. And at the end of '64, when he said, I'm not touring anymore, Brian, you're being disloyal to the band. Well, he says, well, I can't do both. He understood that to produce great records, he needed to sit home and write and have the time to do that. And so, yeah, that he started using the A-list studio musicians who he had met because of his infatuation with Phil Spector, and produced instrumental tracks that the Beach Boys weren't at that point capable of playing. They didn't have the musicianship to do. And, you know, Pet Sounds came from Today and Summer Days. That's a kind of a 3 album sequence that, if you compare it to Rubber Soul Revolver, Sergeant Pepper, that's his 3 albums from that period. Um, Now Smile would have been the fourth, and whether it was going to have been commercially successful, whether it would have been influential, we can argue that all day long, but it would have been an incredible, if you will, art rock experiment at a time when big bands really weren't when the most popular bands really weren't doing that, except for the Beatles. So he understood that to remain relevant, you had to keep growing. And there was an objection from the record company in particular. No, no, can't you give us more stuff like California Girls? And he was like, no, that's not what I'm going to do. And so, yeah, maybe he should have left, but he was too loyal. So he did do whatever you think of Smiley Smile. He did do it, and uh, Wild Honey and Friends is primarily his. So and then it really tails off, and he's off into another world that kind of culminates with the song Till I Die. That's how he feels. He's telling us how he feels. And it's a very troubling life he's lived, a roller coaster of a life.
Yeah, for sure. And he did put it into song. I mean, there's no question that we can track his troubles and successes really. Well, really starting with In My Room from the very beginning, he was
Well,
always,
even the Lonely Sea, there's a
yeah.
melancholy. If you forget the
Hmm.
subject matter, um, there's a sound in his voice that can only come from somebody who is troubled, who is sad, who isn't telling us what he's sad about yet. In My Room is, as you say, the first time we get that.
Yeah, he was really, it's hard to understand what was in his head because one of the things in one of my areas of deep study is 60s music, 60s bands. And I think one of the mistakes that Brian Wilson made with regard to using session musicians, the idea that the Beach Boys weren't good enough to perform in the studio, I don't quite buy that. Here's how it would have happened. And this is what most 60s bands did. And that was the guys played in the studio, and it took long and it cost money, but they got better in the studio. So the Beatles became better studio players because they played in the studio. And that's probably what would happen with the Beach Boys as well. Now, I don't know.
There were sounds that Brian Wilson had in his head that the Beach Boys couldn't do because he was combining instruments to create new
Well,
sounds.
that still could have been
And
done. That still could have been done with the
no,
beat.
no,
Well, sure it could.
he needed 15 people in the rooms. He needed horns and strings. They couldn't do that.
Well, we're
I mean,
talking about basic tracks here. We're talking about guitar, bass, drums, keyboards. Those are things that are basic tracks that can get laid down, and then overdubbing on top of that. That could have been done.
well,
And
it could have been, but they couldn't have met Capitol's demands for albums in terms of spending more time in the studio. I mean, they had to do Beach Boys Party because
That's true.
Capitol was like, where's the next album? Brian says, I'm working on it. I need time. Oh, give us something we can put out.
Well, for
So
that album, I like to dispel one myth about that. The Capitol wanted to put the greatest hits out then. And the Beach Boys and Brian said no, it was his idea to do the party album. It's too bad they didn't get rid of that best of album then. But those are some of the nuances and some of the decisions that got made. Capitol, I mean, as somebody who understands the Beatles' relationship with Capitol very well, Capitol is probably the worst label to have a major band that had any kind of artistic aspirations at all because they had no concept of that. And the Beach Boys are another good example of that. Had no concept. So the Beach Boys were with really the wrong label, as were the Beatles for their formative stuff. We saw what Capitol did to the Beatles material up through
well,
1966.
the Beatles were fine in England. So
Mhm.
so so the albums came out the way they wanted to. It was Capitol who was carving them up like they were a turkey.
Yeah.
But the thing about if we think about the 60s and greatest hits albums, to me that usually signaled that a group's success was behind them. So okay, how can we get one more million seller out of the group? We're going to put out a greatest hits album. And I mean, the best of the Beach Boys isn't even their greatest hits. It's an odd selection of songs. But they kept coming with greatest hits albums and compilations. There must be 75 of them put out by Capitol through the years. I mean, it's
Yeah.
insane.
Well, I actually, yeah, it was very common though. I mean, not just for Capitol, but for other groups as well, that you might have a 2 month period and then some new compilation comes out. And it's almost as if that the Beach Boys in 1966 had two different types of fans. You would have had the people that would have bought the old singles, and you had, well, this new thing, this Pet Sounds, which is far more artistic, that actually sold better than reported. That also was a million seller or a gold record by the end of 1966. It just was not reported.
well, I don't know that it was. I'm not sure where that information comes from because if they only pressed and shipped 300,000, how does it go gold?
Well, I
The,
can
you,
tell you that one of the reasons the Beach Boys did an audit in early 67 of Pet Sounds was they were cooking the books. So I do have the information on it being a gold record by end of year 1966, but that was not certified. So it wasn't made public that those sales existed. And then that's part of the reason why there was an audit. So, I mean, the fact that the album was a top 10 record, I mean, it was pretty much in line with their prior 7 or 8 albums, which were all top 10. So I think that that's been overblown. And looking at the actual numbers, they're the sales, and then you had Good Vibrations. There was a huge triumph, which didn't hurt the sales of any of the albums. I mean, it's almost too bad that that got to be so big because then he tried to do a whole album based on the Good Vibration success. So, I
well,
mean,
but he's an artist. I mean,
mhm.
he's that's the difference. The touring Beach Boys are and still are, thanks to Mike and Bruce, an ongoing business, keeping the free Pet Sounds music out in front of the public. Oh, yeah, of course, they're doing some of the Pet Sounds songs and Good Vibrations, but basically the Beach Boys brand, which is a terrible word to put on a group, but that's the world we live in, is based on fun in the sun, cars, girls, etc. So that's the brand that they had become, and it was very difficult for them to change that in the public's mind and especially in the critics' minds. Pet Sounds did that with tremendous success in England, and the Beach Boys never were looked down upon, were never ridiculed in the UK. They were always looked upon as an important part of popular music. So let's take whatever the sales of Pet Sounds were. If we think of just those people, if would they have bought the Smile album after Good Vibrations. Oh, there's a new album coming out from the same guy who did Pet Sounds and Smile.
Yeah.
Forget everything prior to that. So they would have then been able to move in this new direction. And who knows what that direction would have been? Brian might have said after Smile, guys, I need a rest.
Yeah.
Who the heck
Sure.
knows? But
Yeah.
but but the reality is the record company said to him, "We need more commercial sounds." And he said to them, "See you later." And because they didn't know what commercial sounds were. You're right. The Capitol had no idea what was going to be commercial in 1966. But was anybody at the label, was anybody within the group paying attention to what was on the charts in 66 and 67? Because the music world had changed so rapidly since California Girls that to expect that more California Girls was going to be what the public wanted was crazy. And if Brian hadn't done Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations, then the Beach Boys would have been just the West Coast Four Seasons, a whole bunch of hits
Mm.
that people said, "Oh, great, I love the Four Seasons hits." That would have been it. And then they have to have another hit under the name. Guess what was the name of it? What was the name of the they released a song of the Four Seasons. I wonder who or
Oh, yeah, yeah. The Wonder Who. Yeah.
though yeah. So the Four Seasons have to release a song Wonder Who because they're somebody's telling them, "Oh, yeah, you put Four Seasons on the label, it might not get played." And of
I
course, it
would,
gets.
yeah, I would say with regard to Capital, I mean, I would have to give them some credit because once Good Vibrations hit, they're like, okay, well, let's go in this direction. They'll just follow where the money is. So, I mean, Brian was given the latitude to do a Good Vibrations album length version. He was already working on it, but they just wanted it like right away, which couldn't be done. So I think Capital got halfway there. And in the middle of that is when uh, there was the lawsuit between the group and Capitol. So that halted everything.
A
I,
lot of
I
a lot of a lot of the lawsuit, by the way, had to do with the breakage clause in their contract,
oh, did it? Okay.
which was from the days of 78's, that they deducted a certain percentage of your royalties based on how many records broke. Well, of course, vinyl didn't break. So was what I was told was primary to the lawsuit. But so the lawsuit didn't help. But if you think about the Beatles, Revolver comes out what August 66,
Mhm.
and there isn't another Beatles album for till June of 67. So the Beatles had latitude, sure,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, the label's demanding a single gets us this wonderful Strawberry Fields Penny Lane double-sided A hit, but it changes the direction of Sergeant Pepper, which by reports was going to be more autobiographical than it turned out to be.
Mhm.
So the labels were doing neither group a favor at any point along the way. There's that great clip of the Beatles walking into Abbey Road Studios in like December '66, and have you broken up? No, it's like no, we're still a group. We're making records. Um,
Yeah, God forbid the Beatles should take a month off or so, which they did at the end of 66, a month and a half. I mean, God forbid you should rest at all.
yeah.
And
So
poor Brian, he could have used a bit of a rest. And yeah, it was just the um, the uh, the trail of what they were asking for, demanding of their artists was just, not human.
and if we look back at record companies, perhaps the word is perhaps the worst thing that was done to the Beach Boys was to name them the Beach Boys, which isn't a name they wanted particularly. Um, but once it was on them, that was who they were, the Beach Boys. What are you going to sing about? Well, you're going to sing about the surf. You're going to sing about girls. You're going to sing about cars. And they milked that as dry as it could be done. And then in 65, Brian realizes we're going in a different direction and very successfully does that with the Today album.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, it's he knew what he was doing. And as David Anderle says, he needed unconditional support. He didn't he didn't respond well to doubt or being questioned. And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
and the thing that is hard to understand, because there's almost no footage of them in the studios. There's nobody who kept a diary of what was going on. But when they came back from England in November of '66, they came back as David Neely said, conquering heroes, but largely on the strength of Good Vibrations and Pet Sounds, which there had been doubts about. So it seems like they should have thought, gee, Brian knows what he's doing. So when they heard the songs, they should have been, Brian, this is the most incredible stuff we've ever heard. This is amazing. It should have just been, that's what he needed and didn't get.
Well, I think the problem, Brian, him needing the constant support, even with you years later for the Presents project, he needed so much handholding. I mean, that doesn't happen in the industry. I mean, he's in an industry where they chew you up and spit you out, and if you can't hack it, you're going to get trodden over, and that's basically what happened to him. He needed so much coddling that I mean, there was only so much that could be given to him, and his constitution just wasn't strong enough. He had the talent, he had everything else, but that constitution to mentally get through it, he just couldn't do it.
I think that's a good point. The sadness is um, what happened to him before there was the notion of even there being a recording called Surfing, that he had grown up. None of us were in the Wilson household. Uh, Brian is pretty clear, as was Dennis, about the amount of abuse they suffered at Murray's hands, and I don't think people ever get over that.
Correct. Yeah.
And so you add that to the demands of an industry, as you described, that's insatiable, and then you mix in drugs and you mix in doubts and whatever strengths he had at the beginning of '66 when he recorded Pet Sounds, the songs for Pet Sounds, and the Beach Boys came back and didn't understand what those were after their Japanese tour, and he said, "We're going to do it," and they did it, and they did it beautifully, and it was you know a great piece of art, regardless of how Capitol cooked the books. It went to number 10. It didn't go high enough to make Capitol happy enough that they have to put out Best of the Beach Boys to meet sales quota. That's why they put out Best of the Beach Boys according to their product manager. So now what is Brian supposed to do? He's working on Good Vibrations. He finishes Good Vibrations. He starts working on Smile. All the while, the Beach Boys are on tour. And when they come back from England, um, he is confronted with the fact that they don't like this new group of people around him, and he doesn't know what to do.
Mhm.
And and it just eats away at him.
Yeah, I
Uh,
would I would also parallel this with the Beatles. I mean, since Brian wasn't part of the touring group, when you are not part of the touring band, that takes some of the camaraderie away. Once the Beatles stopped touring, they faced the same thing. They started to grow apart. It wasn't that whole us against them mentality anymore. And the Beatles lost a little something, I think, when they stopped touring. And they never really got that back. And I think Brian being apart from the guys in that way, not that he could have done both, but I think that there was
well,
physical
there's
distance and a figurative distance as well.
well, you're right about that. He was the leader. They were the group. He sent them out on the road, as Dennis said, were his messengers. They went out there and did it. So there's a camaraderie, but it's more a camaraderie of, they're arguing over which girl they're going to get after the show,
Yeah.
which is, Beatlesque, if you will.
Mhm. And I
Um,
think the family ties probably kept them tighter than most other bands that would have been in a similar situation. I think those family ties really kept them more together than otherwise would have been.
well, but there was a Hatfields and McCoys quality to it as well. especially as the 60s went on and Carl and Dennis became experimenters with chemicals and Mike didn't. So there was really a split. So by the time the 70s roll around, and they're getting, they're successful again after Endless Summer, there's actually a plane with the meditators and the non-meditators. There's a plane that's got the people who use drugs and not use drugs. I mean, they were split.
Mhm.
The family ties were kept them together, but family ties are not necessarily the best thing in the world. Imagine if in 1969 the Beach Boys had finished their Capitol contract and Carl Dennis and Brian had said, "Okay, we've had enough of this. We're going to do a group called the Wilson Brothers," and they had gone off to do whatever they wanted to do. Would it have been successful? Who knows? It takes a lot of work to build a band. You know, and there's always jealousies and all of that. But would that have reignited Brian's willingness to work? Who knows? But being part of this Beach Boys um, brand wasn't, as he said in an interview in the 70s. My group for the last few years has been Spring, his wife's group.
Mhm.
So he he had grown away from them as much as they had grown away from him. And yeah, there's a camaraderie on the road, but th there's a certain uh, insanity to this story that if one member is living, there's a headline in a 1968 UK paper, an article, an interview with Dennis Wilson. He says, "I live with 17 girls," referring to the Notorious family he lived with. Um, how there's no way for that to bring you together. You're
Yeah.
already you're already split apart in ways that are unimaginable.
And I think, yeah, I would add to that that the industry was moving in a direction completely opposite of what the Beach Boys were doing, and that is guitar-based rock. When, Cream came out, and then you had all these great guitarists from the San Francisco Sound, and then Beck Page. All of that was a louder sound, a raunchier sound based on guitars. And the Beach Boys were the antithesis of that. So that was very hard for them to keep up. As great as that late 60s music was, which is my favorite period of theirs, it wasn't keeping up with what the trend was, which was guitars.
Um, they were not ever going to be a hard rock band. Um, they were not going to be the Jimi Hendrix Experience. That just wasn't who they were. But the Fifth Dimension was having hits on the charts. There was a place on the charts. There was always a place on the charts for great pop
That's
vocal
very true.
singles.
That's very true.
And so I think they had just run out the string really. Um, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, and 67. That's a lot of hit records. That's a lot of years to be
Yeah.
having hit records. I think people, there just might have been a fatigue at top 40 radio with them. There's this new group, there's this new sound. People
Yeah.
always want something that's new. So
Very true.
what's
Mhm.
the Beach Boys' biggest uh, post Smile hit? Do it again.
Do it again.
You
Yeah.
know, it's and so in 74 when Capitol succeeds with Endless Summer beyond anyone's imagination, reportedly Carl Wilson looked at the cover and said, "Well, this is a joke, right? This isn't the real cover." And it was the real cover. It was just this bizarre illustration of them, and it becomes a massive success, and that permanently made them, if you will, an oldies band. There was
Mhm.
nothing that could change that.
And the
Really, the
60s.
first.
Yeah,
I'm
I was
sorry.
going
Go
to
ahead.
mention the 60s, well, the Beatles, they had the Red and the Blue albums, those big compilations, which preceded the Endless Summer. The Beatles were already done. So the nail was in the coffin for a lot of these 60s groups. And even the Stones did their hot rocks. They were one of the few that could reinvent themselves a bit. But yeah, I mean, The 60s bands, very few of them made it into the 70s. And there was just the changing of the guard. And I give the Beach Boys credit for continuing to produce good music into up until like the mid 70s, where it was very solid stuff, even though it was rocky roads along the way. They were still doing it somehow. I don't know how they were, but they were doing it.
Well, yeah, but if you look at each album and you say, what was the best single from Holland? It's
Sailing
Sail on a
Sailor.
Sailor.
Yeah, great song.
What was the best single from Carl and the Passions? It was Marcella, Brian's song. So Brian was still writing the best music. Dennis was writing beautiful, soulful ballads in that era. Sometimes he was withholding his music from Beach Boys albums. Sometimes he was told, this is too depressing or whatever to be on a Beach Boys. I mean, there was just this internal conflict of what direction we should go in because Sunflower, arguably the best post Smile album of their career. I don't know who would argue for anything other than Sunflower, honestly. Um, it's as great a pop vocal album as imaginable, and it flopped miserably
Hmm.
because AM radio didn't want it and FM radio didn't want it, with some exceptions. So it was a they crawled out of this giant hole that 60s bands were in with terrific ability to and determination. They went from a group in the 60s who were playing 25 and 30-minute sets to, I saw them in 71. The concert was like 2.5 hours.
Oh, really? Wow.
And then they were that was at the gym at that was at the gym at Georgetown University. The next year I saw them at Carnegie Hall, and then after that at Madison Square Garden. So they were rebuilding their audience before Endless Summer. It was Endless Summer that put the nail in the coffin of new material being great,
Hmm.
because suddenly Warner Brothers Records is saying to the Beach Boys, "Hey guys, they're having all these hits, Spirit of America, with your old stuff. We need Brian back at the helm to make an album." And that was not the right decision. That was a disaster. That whole Brian is back was just
Yeah.
it was filled with mistakes. Imagine in 1977 if the Beach Boys' new album had been Pacific Ocean Blue,
Mm.
all of Dennis's beautiful music.
Yeah,
That
that would have
was
been a different ball game altogether.
as opposed to Keeping the Summer Alive, which was just rehash. And it's not that there aren't good songs on each album. Good Timing is a great song. I mean, they're there. It's just that the public wants the hits, and pretty much only the hits. And that's that's pretty much who we all are as concert goers. And and when you're an up and coming group, when no one knows you and you don't have hits, you build your audience based on your playing, and you have these are your fans. Well, 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later, 50 years later, now 60 years later, well, who's going to come to your concert? It's going to be the people who know and love your greatest hits. And they're still out there playing, you know, big markets and small markets and going overseas, and they're still bringing the idea of the Beach Boys to the world, which is amazing.
Yeah, and they still pack them in, and people want to hear the old. And there's enough fans there that like to hear the obscure stuff, and they've got such a wide base of fans that you can have a concert and sprinkle in some obscure stuff, which is great, and so you can satisfy both types of fans.
Sure. I
And
mean, yeah, I
mhm.
mean, when they did their reunion tour in 2012, I thought that the album that came out of that reunion was beyond belief what we would have expected from the Beach Boys at that point in their career. It, I don't know how it exactly happened. Somebody told me the album's called That's Why God Made the Radio, and
Mhm.
somebody told me they were having lunch and somebody was complimenting Brian on one of his singles, and in the middle of biting a hamburger, he goes, "Well, that's why God made the radio." I mean, there's all these stories and legends, and the idea of the story ever being told all where is the Beach Boys Mark Lewison? Well, he doesn't exist. So I'm doing it in bits and pieces, which is why the Smile book is intended to tell that story as compactly as possible. But there's the Beach Boys library, which compared there must be well over 1,000 Beatles books at this point. The Beach Boys library might be close to 50 to 100, and everyone will tell you the story differently. As I describe it in talking about Smile in the book, it's like you're looking through a kaleidoscope and you see it one way and you turn it and you see it another way. Everybody, including you and me, has a different point of view of it, and they're all valid. The the tragedy is we didn't get the music in 67, and that's undoable. The fact that we finally got the music in the 21st century is indeed joyous and something to celebrate. But there's no way I mean, imagine if after Magical Mystery Tour, the Beatles had said, we're not going to do any more albums, and we didn't get the White Album and Abbey Road. I mean, what would we have felt like as Beatles fans? We would
Very
have
true.
lost we would have
Yeah.
lost an awful lot.
Hmm.
But the number of groups who have managed to go into a second decade um, without it becoming an oldies group, I think you can count them on one hand.
Pretty much, almost none. The Grateful Dead, the Kinks, maybe, the Who, very few.
Yeah, and the Stones you mentioned for
And the
sure.
Stones. And those are the biggies, really. I mean, those are the biggest of the era, really. So yeah, it's very few do. And the Beach Boys held their own. And the fact that Smile came out in the iterations that it did in 2004 and 2011, I think is a miracle. I mean, I really do. And I
Well, it
think
is.
good
It
things
is.
come to those who wait. And we really, as fans, we really, I didn't ever think we'd see what we see. So I'm completely content with what we've been given over the last 15 or so years. And, if nothing else comes out, I'm fine with that because they've given us so much. And luckily, Brian stuck with it. So what I said earlier about not having the Constitution, he had the staying power, and I mean, he stuck it out, and in the end delivered.
Well,
It took
he
30 years, but he did deliver in the end.
he lived through such horrible times, whether it was drug abuse with he and Dennis, to the 9 years in prison with the psychologist whose name I won't mention, to finally
I think it's
coming
Mark
out.
David Chapman, isn't it?
Oh God,
I'm
you
kidding.
know, I was so glad I didn't have to mention my name in the U.S. I'm so glad I didn't have to mention his name in the U.S. versus John Lennon. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the and really what it was Brian being surrounded and building a critical mass of people who just loved him for what he had done, for what he was as a person, not expecting there to be any more. So when he started touring in 1999, the audiences were there just to cheer him on, to
Mm-hmm.
thank him. They weren't expecting what was to come. Nobody thought there'd ever be a Pet Sounds tour. Yeah, I mean, it really, when you think about where he was I think he was in Milwaukee on that very first tour.
Was
Um,
he?
and
Could be.
and
Yeah, a lot of tours start here in the Midwest.
wait, no, he started in Ann Arbor. He did four,
Okay.
four, four dates, and he played one Wisconsin date. And in the middle of the show, he's like, "Okay, okay, we're all going to sing on Wisconsin." I mean, he was coming out of his shell because there was an audience who was there to see him. And it was this kind of just mass unconditional love that gave him the confidence to keep moving forward. Finishing Smile gave him the confidence to do new music and new ideas. So we got that Lucky Old Son and the Gershwin album. It gave him the confidence to do the Beach Boys reunion. I mean, it's the most improbable second act of in artistic history, I think. And
Agreed. Which is why your book is titled The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson.
well, yes, it is. And it's when I was making Beautiful Dreamer, the third act was what's going to happen. I knew how to tell the rise and the fall. I did not know how to, I didn't know if he was going to go up the steps at the Royal Festival Hall and perform it. I didn't know how the audience was going to respond, um, nor did he. But as he said, because the week before he was really scared,
Yeah.
and Melinda says, Brian, we can call this off. And he says, no, I have to do it. I have to do it. So there was a sense of courage and willpower that I don't even know how to explain it other than just pure courage on his part
Mhm.
that he was gonna do this. That nobody expected he would ever do it, and it led to the happiest period of his life in the years that I knew him, have known him. I first met him in 1976, so it's been coming up on a half century.
Wow. Well, am going to give you my congratulations on the book. I know it's doing very well. It's only been out a week.
Thank
And
you.
for those people who want, highly suggest it. This is the first time the resurrection of Brian Wilson is really being told, and you spend a lot of time really going into that. I think that's the strength of this book. So I'm going to have
Yeah.
some links below for people that want to order it right away, a couple clicks away, and it'll be yours. And great to have you on, David. Really, I never expected that we would meet, and I didn't expect this book would be coming out actually. So
Well,
I'm glad it came out.
well, Matt, I didn't either because when I proposed it to the publisher who had done God Only Knows, the reissue of the Beach Boys and the California Myth with an update that was, more than half the length of the original. He said, "What kind of a book do you have in mind?" This was to be for the 20th anniversary of Brian Wilson Presents Smile. And I said, "I think publishing all of the interviews that I had done for Beautiful Dreamer would be great, because 99% of them didn't make it into the film." And he said, "No, books with interviews don't do well for us." He said, "But if you want to do an oral history, okay." So it was his this way or the highway, because an oral history is just an enormous amount of work as opposed to, okay, let's just sequence these transcripts. Now, figuring out how to take the right quotes and put them in order, it was like making a 12-hour documentary.
Mm.
And Nelson Bragg, from Brian's band, when he read it, he had a great quote. He said, "Beautiful Dreamer is like the Cliff Notes version of this book." I, I'm really proud of how much material there is in this book that no one has ever heard before. There's an entire anthology in the back of the book with essays from people that, from Tom Nolan on, that I think will surprise a lot of people. Uh, Again, if I counted up the word total, I think 75 I think 75% of the words in this book are not mine. I'm the curator, I'm the contextualizer, I'm the connector, but I'm not telling this story so much as the people who were there are. And I think the publisher saying no, it has to be an oral history was what made this book worth doing and makes it worth reading. And it's a pretty intense read, I think. Um, it's not something you could breeze through, and I think that's good because Smile is not something you can breeze through. You get the feeling like Brian, I think in the 66, 67, like, is this ever going to end?
Yeah.
And fortunately, we do have the resurrection.
Well, and that is there for us to see with Beautiful Dreamer, hear with the releases, and now read with your book. So I'm so glad that people have so many options now with Smile. It's amazing what's available to them to absorb now. So I'm very glad
Thank
for
you,
that.
Matt. Yeah,
Mhm.
don't forget Dominic Priore's books. I mean,
Yes,
they're worth reading as well because, as Mojo Magazine said, he is the preeminent smileologist in the world, and Dominic has an essay in the anthology in the back as well.
Yeah, I do have his book, and it's required reading for understanding Smile. And he sets it up very well. He does a great job on the history. So that's a book I've recommended as well. So the two of those together, I think, and you don't cover the same ground either. So I think those two books belong on the bookshelf together.
Well, and his book, Look, Listen, Vibrate, Smile, of course, sets it all up.
Correct, correct.
So,
Hmm.
so, so we understand. So it's kind of a trilogy, but ultimately, as I suggest, there's a point in the book where we're getting to Smile. I suggest if you haven't listened to the Smile sessions in a while, or if you've never listened to it, now's a good time to listen to tracks 1 through 19 on disc one of the Beach Boys Smile sessions, because that makes you want to read more because it's the music that makes this story meaningful.
Very true.
Ultimately, it is a story of one man's triumph against all the odds. But if without the music, it's just a story.
Very true. And sometimes, this for a while, the story was bigger than the music, and I'm not sure. I would say the music is bigger than the story, but I mean, the story's fascinating.
It is indeed. It's I had the same challenge Brian had with Smile, not from an artistic point of view, but just there's so many pieces to the story that don't exist.
Mm.
People who are no longer with us, people who don't want to talk and share their specific memories. So I had to do the best I could with what I did, and for the most part, every word in the book from the people who were there comes from something that I did as an interview that I could either hear or see. So it's firsthand research, and I think that's important. That this isn't stuff that I'm just kind of speculating on. This is the people who were there talking, and people who you don't necessarily expect to hear from, like Carl Wilson's first wife Annie, or Van Dyke Park's first wife Dury, who have fascinating insights into all this. Derek Taylor's wife, or widow. I mean, people who were there sharing with us as much as they can about the story.
And I'm glad you mentioned the music again, and it gives me a little opportunity to peddle my wares, my humble assemblage of my version of Smile I have on my podcast. So I'll put that link below for anybody who wants to get a taste of it before you delve into some of the Brian Wilson Presents and all the other great fan mixes that are out there, of which there are many. So
I wish I had heard that before we did this. Um,
I'll give
yeah,
you the link. Yeah, it's mine clocks in I think at exactly 40 minutes, and it's not, I mean, I think a lot are similar. But to do this single album, I kind of like the less is more thing, so it works for me. And as I said in my video series on the Beach Boys, if I heard a fan mix, I would have thought it was a completed album. I wouldn't have understood that, hey, this needs more vocals or more. I just thought it was really good as it was. So there's plenty of music there and new
absolutely.
stuff for people to just delve into. And I think if they're lovers of 60s progressive music, they're going to love Smile.
Well, that's Brian was leading the way in terms of popular music. The Beach Boys were, a big name in those days. Frank Zappa was certainly making progressive music, but his fan base was I would say a limited cult.
Mhm.
But
Agreed.
Brian understood the need to make progressive music. He understood the need to advance, and I think that's the story of Smile as much as anything.
Well, let's end it there, David. Great discussion here. Thank you so much for sharing some time with us.
My
And
pleasure.
maybe we'll have you back. I mean, maybe there'll be more to talk about. I mean, is this the end of the road? I don't know. I mean, we'll see how this all plays out over time. And I'm always up for talking about it.
It's never the end of the road, but if you'd like, I could come back, in a few months after your viewers have had a chance to read the book and ask and they can ask me any questions they want through you,
Hmm.
and because the book sometimes um, addresses questions that can't be answered, and so I didn't like to do too much speculation, um, but Again, Nelson Bragg from Brian's band said this book answers all the questions you had about Smile and answers questions you didn't even know you had, which is a wonderful thing to say. But there are certain questions I know I didn't answer because I didn't have the answer.
Well, we'll leave that for next time. I'm sure.
Good.
I love getting questions, and sometimes people ask me some great questions. So I would expect that. So yeah, let's have you back. I'd be happy to
Thank
have you
you.
again, and we'll pick up where we left off.
Thank you, Matt. Great to talk to you.